By 27, Vanessa Marcotte had built a life in New York that seemed to be moving quickly forward. She had a demanding job at one of the biggest technology companies in the world. She had friends, ambition, and the kind of career people spend years trying to reach. But the place where Vanessa felt safest was still the small Massachusetts town where her family lived. Vanessa was born on June 17, 1989, in Leominster, Massachusetts. She was the only daughter of John and Rosanna Marcotte, and family remained at the center of her life long after she grew up and moved away. The distance between Massachusetts and New York changed her address. It did not weaken those relationships. As a girl, Vanessa attended Bancroft School in Worcester. She was bright, focused, and willing to put in the work. Those qualities followed her to Boston University, where she studied communications and graduated with honors in 2011. Communications suited her. Vanessa was naturally sociable, friendly, and comfortable connecting with people. But charm alone did not build her career. The people who worked with her saw someone driven and dependable, someone who wanted to keep moving forward and had the discipline to make that happen. After college, she worked at WordStream, a marketing startup based in Boston. She also spent time at Vistaprint. Each position took her another step along a professional path that was beginning to accelerate. Then, in 2015, Vanessa joined Google as an account manager at the company's New York office. Think about where she was at that point. She was only in her mid-20s, living in New York City and working for a company recognized around the world. Her colleagues saw ambition in her. They believed she had a bright future ahead of her, and there was every reason to think they were right. But a resume gives you only the clean outline of a person. School, degree, job titles, promotions. It does not tell you what it felt like to be around them. In photographs of Vanessa with relatives and friends, she rarely seems detached from the moment. She is smiling, leaning toward the people beside her, fully part of whatever is happening. Those images reflect the way the people who knew her described her: energetic, warm, social, and deeply connected to the people she loved. That matters here. Before Vanessa became the name attached to a homicide investigation, she was a daughter, a niece, a friend, and a young professional whose life was still expanding. She had plans that had nothing to do with what would later make her known across the country. She also liked to stay active. Running, yoga, long walks, and time outdoors were ordinary parts of her routine. Going out alone for some exercise was not a sudden decision or a break from her habits. It was something she did regularly. And despite the speed of her life in New York, Vanessa kept returning to Massachusetts. Every couple of months, she tried to visit her mother and aunt in Princeton. These were not visits to an unfamiliar place. She had known the area since childhood. She understood its roads, its trails, and the wooded landscape surrounding the town. Princeton sits between the larger cities of Boston and Worcester, but it feels far removed from both. At the time, it had a population of only around 3,000 people. Rural roads pass through stretches of forest and open land. Homes are separated by trees, distance, and long driveways. It is the kind of town where quiet is part of the appeal. For Vanessa, it was home territory. On Sunday, August 7, 2016, she was visiting Rosanna at the family home on Brooks Station Road. The weather was warm and clear. It was the kind of bright summer afternoon that gives you no reason to hurry indoors. Vanessa was due to return to New York later that day. She planned to catch an evening bus, which meant there was still time to spend with her mother and take a walk before leaving. At around 1:00 p.m., Vanessa stepped out of the house. Depending on later accounts, the outing has been described as a walk or a jog. Either way, it fit naturally into her day. She was wearing exercise clothes, she knew the area, and she intended to visit places that were already familiar to her. There was no anxious goodbye, no indication that she expected to be gone long. She was simply making use of the time she had before the trip back to New York. Not long after Vanessa left, a witness reportedly saw her on one of the nearby paths, speaking on her phone. That sighting would become part of the effort to piece together her movements, although it should be treated for what it was, a witness account, not a minute-by-minute reconstruction. Still, the detail sounded like Vanessa. Her work kept her closely connected to her smartphone, and friends and family knew her as someone who made an effort to stay in touch. Seeing her walking and talking on the phone in the early afternoon would not have looked alarming. Nothing about her decision appeared unusual. She had gone out in clear weather, during the brightest part of the day. She was less than a mile from her mother's house, following a route through an area she had known for years. She still had an evening bus to catch. As far as anyone at home understood, Vanessa would finish her exercise, come back, and continue with the rest of her plans. There was no obvious reason to believe she was in danger. And that is what makes the beginning of this case so unsettling. There was no reckless choice to explain away. No unfamiliar destination. No late-night detour. Vanessa was doing something she had done many times before, in a place where she had every reason to feel comfortable. The first sign that this was not an ordinary afternoon was not a scream or an emergency call. It was silence. Vanessa stopped answering her phone. Rosanna knew her daughter's habits well enough to recognize when a delay had become something more serious. By approximately 4:00 p.m., waiting no longer felt safe. Vanessa had left the house on Brooks Station Road around 1 o'clock. She was expected to return before catching an evening bus back to New York. A walk of a few hours would not have been unusual. Vanessa enjoyed being active, and she knew the roads and trails around Princeton from years of visiting family there. But she also stayed connected. Her work kept her close to her phone, and she made a point of keeping in touch with the people who cared about her. If her plans changed, she could call. If she was running late, she could send a message. That was what made the silence feel wrong. Rosanna tried to reach her daughter. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. At first, there were ordinary explanations. Maybe Vanessa had lost track of time. Maybe her phone battery had died. Maybe the signal had dropped somewhere along the route. In a rural town like Princeton, none of those possibilities would have sounded impossible. But there is a point when reassurance stops working. Rosanna reached it quickly. Vanessa had an evening bus to catch. She had responsibilities waiting for her in New York, and she was not someone who would knowingly leave her mother frightened without making contact. So, at around 4 that afternoon, Rosanna called law enforcement. She told them Vanessa had gone out hours earlier and had not returned. She urged officers to search the area around Brooks Station Road. This was no longer a mother casually checking on a late daughter. Rosanna believed something had happened, and authorities treated that concern seriously. The search began that same afternoon, with Princeton officials and Massachusetts State Police personnel joining the effort. K-9 resources were brought in. Volunteers and members of the community also helped as attention turned toward the roads, trails, and wooded areas surrounding Vanessa's route. Now, Princeton was small. Only around 3,000 people lived there. But small did not mean easy to search. Brooks Station Road cut through a landscape of narrow pavement, scattered homes, and heavy woodland. Trees crowded close to the roadside. Thick summer vegetation covered the ground beyond it. In places, the brush was dense enough to hide what lay only a short distance from view. That mattered. Someone driving past could look into the woods and see nothing unusual. Searchers could stand near the road and still miss something concealed behind leaves, branches, and uneven ground. There were countless places where an injured person, or evidence of a crime, might remain invisible unless someone went in and checked carefully. So the search pushed outward. Officers worked through the places Vanessa might reasonably have walked. Search teams examined the area near her mother's home and moved through the surrounding terrain. A police dog tracked through vegetation while people called Vanessa's name and watched for anything that might explain why she had not come back. They were still searching for a missing woman. At least, officially. But as the hours passed, that distinction became harder to hold on to. 4 o'clock became 5, then 6. Every unanswered call made the harmless explanations less convincing. Vanessa had not contacted her mother. She had not returned to prepare for her trip. No one had heard from her with a simple explanation for the delay, and daylight was beginning to fade. Think about the pressure of that moment. Searchers were working against more than the size of the area. Darkness would make the woods harder to navigate and the ground harder to read. Details that stood out in daylight could disappear after sunset. If Vanessa was hurt somewhere, each passing hour mattered. The operation continued. More ground was covered. The possibility that Vanessa had simply taken a longer walk became increasingly remote. What had begun as a worried call from a mother was turning into something much more urgent. Then, at approximately 8:30 that evening, a police dog led searchers away from the more visible route and toward a secluded wooded location. It was less than a mile from the Marcotte home. That distance is difficult to process. Vanessa had not vanished into some distant wilderness. She had been close to the place where she was staying, close to the road, close to the home where her mother had been waiting for her to walk back through the door. But the vegetation was dense, and the location was hidden from ordinary view. There, searchers found the body of a young woman. The scene immediately changed the nature of the case. Vanessa had suffered a severe physical assault. Her body was partially burned, indicating that someone had tried to set it on fire. Whatever had happened in those woods, the person responsible had apparently attempted to interfere with the evidence, or destroy it altogether. This was not an accident. It was not a medical emergency, and it was not a walk that had somehow gone wrong. Investigators were looking at a homicide scene. Despite the condition in which she was found, officers immediately saw that the woman resembled Vanessa. The identification confirmed what Rosanna had feared from the moment her daughter stopped answering. The search was over. Now came the notification no parent should ever receive. Only hours earlier, Rosanna had watched Vanessa leave for a familiar walk in broad daylight. She had expected her daughter to come home, collect her things, and catch a bus back to New York. Instead, police had to tell her that Vanessa had been found dead less than a mile away. The place mattered almost as much as the timing. Princeton was where Vanessa visited family. She knew these surroundings. She felt comfortable there. Her mother had every reason to believe that an afternoon walk near home was one of the safest, most ordinary things Vanessa could do. By nightfall, that belief had been shattered. Police secured the wooded area and began the painstaking work of preserving the scene. The attempted burning raised an immediate question: how much had the attacker managed to destroy? Fire can damage biological material, erase traces, and complicate the reconstruction of a crime. If that had been the intention, investigators needed to know whether it had worked. They had no obvious suspect waiting for them. There was no known argument that explained the attack, no clear personal dispute pointing toward a name, and no immediate reason Vanessa should have been targeted on that road. The search for a missing daughter had ended within hours. A homicide investigation began in the same place where Vanessa and her family had always believed she was safe. The attacker had attempted to erase what happened in those woods. But on Vanessa's hands, investigators found something the fire had not destroyed. The crime scene offered detectives two conflicting pictures. It showed an offender trying to conceal evidence, and a victim who had fought hard enough to collect evidence of her own. The burns found on Vanessa's head, arms, and legs suggested that someone had attempted to destroy or disguise what had happened there. But the effort had not been completed. Whatever the attacker intended to do, he left the scene with evidence still intact. And some of the most important evidence was on Vanessa herself. The medical examiner determined that she had been beaten and strangled. Her hyoid bone, a small, U-shaped bone in the neck, was fractured. That injury helped confirm the violence and force used during the attack. There was also evidence that Vanessa had been sexually assaulted. That part of the case needs to be handled carefully, because years later, when the prosecution reached a plea agreement with the man charged in her death, the final conviction did not include rape. The absence of a rape conviction, however, did not erase what investigators and the medical examiner documented at the beginning of the case. It reflected the terms of the later agreement, not a reversal of the original findings. Then there were Vanessa's hands. They bore injuries consistent with a desperate physical struggle. She had not simply been surprised and immediately overpowered. She had resisted. She had fought the person attacking her, and in doing so, she had done something neither she nor her killer could have understood in that moment. She had collected his DNA. Male genetic material was recovered from beneath Vanessa's fingernails. Investigators sent it for analysis, hoping it could become the direct forensic link between the crime scene and the man responsible. That sounds like the moment a case should break wide open. On television, unknown DNA goes into a computer, a screen flashes, and a suspect's name appears. Real investigations are not that simple. A DNA profile is extraordinarily useful when police have someone to compare it against. If investigators eventually collect a sample from the right person, the profile can confirm that connection with tremendous precision. But an unknown profile is not automatically an identity. If the person is not already in the relevant databases, and if there is no immediate match, detectives are left holding a powerful answer to a question they have not yet solved. The DNA could tell them, "This is the man." It could not yet tell them, "Here is his name." So detectives had to begin with the routes that usually lead to a homicide suspect. They examined Vanessa's personal relationships. They looked at her professional circle, her friends, and the people she communicated with. They worked through her movements and the known events of that Sunday. They considered whether she had arranged to see anyone during her walk, whether someone had followed her from elsewhere, or whether a conflict from her life in New York had somehow reached her mother's quiet town in Massachusetts. Her phone and communications mattered. So did the timing of her walk. If Vanessa had planned to meet someone, detectives needed to find the message, call, relationship, or other point of contact that connected them. But no such trail emerged. Nothing investigators found suggested that Vanessa had gone out expecting to meet the person who attacked her. There was no known history between her and the offender. No prior threat. No obvious dispute. No relationship that supplied a motive. Gradually, the possibility detectives least wanted became the one they had to take most seriously. Vanessa had probably encountered a stranger, and that changed the shape of the investigation. When a victim knows the killer, there is usually some shared history to examine. Detectives can ask who had been angry, jealous, controlling, or afraid. They can reconstruct arguments, financial pressures, breakups, threats, and private messages. Even when someone lies, the relationship itself gives investigators a place to start. A random attack removes nearly all of that. There may be no motive connected to the victim's life because the offender did not choose her for anything she had done. There may be no calls between them, no photographs together, no mutual friends, and no witness who ever saw them in the same place before the crime. Their first known encounter may also be their last. That was the wall detectives were facing. Somewhere, there was a man whose DNA had been preserved beneath Vanessa's fingernails. But in every other ordinary sense, he appeared to have no connection to her at all. Witness reports offered the first outline of a person who might matter. People in the area recalled seeing a suspicious man near a dark-colored SUV. Based on the available accounts, investigators developed a cautious working description: a Latino or Hispanic man, medium height, with an athletic build. Because Vanessa had fought so hard, detectives believed the attacker might have carried visible scratches, bruises, or other injuries afterward. None of those details was enough by itself. A dark SUV was hardly rare. The physical description could apply to many people. Even scratches would fade, and unless someone noticed them at exactly the right time, that part of the evidence could disappear within days. Still, it was something the public could recognize. Investigators considered whether the offender lived in Princeton or one of the nearby communities. The location suggested that he may have understood the area, its roads, its quieter stretches, and the routes that allowed someone to leave quickly. But living nearby was not the only possibility. He might have passed through Princeton regularly for work or had another reason to know the town without appearing in Vanessa's personal life. That theory widened the search at the same time it gave it direction. The public was asked to report anything unusual: a man matching the description, unexplained injuries after August 7th, or a dark-colored SUV seen near the area. A tip line gave residents a direct way to share what they remembered. Justice for Vanessa signs kept her name, and the search for the vehicle and the unknown man in public view. Detectives now had 3 pieces that could eventually converge: a male DNA profile, a partial physical description, and a possible vehicle. What they did not have was the one thing every lead needed: a name. Then another young woman was killed more than 150 miles away, only days before Vanessa's death, and the similarities forced investigators to ask whether they were hunting one man or two. Karina Vetrano had also gone out alone and been attacked near a running route. For a moment, 2 horrifying cases appeared capable of fitting together. Vetrano was killed in Queens, New York, only days before Vanessa's murder. The timing was impossible to ignore. Both victims were young women. Both had been alone. Both were attacked outdoors, near routes used for running or walking. And because Vanessa lived in New York City, the possible connection did not seem entirely unreasonable. Investigators have to consider links like that, even when the crimes happen in different jurisdictions. They compare the setting, the timing, the victim's activities, the injuries. They look at how an offender approached, how much control he used, what he did at the scene, and whether he tried to conceal evidence afterward. One matching detail can be coincidence. Several can suggest a pattern. And if the same person had committed both murders, detectives needed to know quickly. It would change the scale of the investigation. It could mean they were not looking for someone tied to Princeton at all, but for an offender moving between communities, or even between states. But the similarities only went so far. As investigators examined the available evidence, meaningful differences emerged in the nature of the attacks. The physical distance between Queens and Princeton also mattered. Geography alone could not rule out a connection, of course. People travel. Work routes cross state lines. But there still had to be evidence placing one offender within reach of both crime scenes. That evidence never developed. The feared connection gradually faded, and the two cases moved in separate directions. For the detectives in Massachusetts, that meant returning to the harder possibility. Vanessa had probably encountered someone with a connection to the Princeton area, even if that connection was temporary. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he worked nearby. Maybe he drove through often enough to know where the roads narrowed, where the trails ran, and where a person could disappear from view. That conclusion narrowed the map. It did not give them a name. For approximately 8 months, investigators worked through more than 1,300 tips from members of the public. Think about what that number actually means. Not 1,300 suspects. 1,300 separate claims, memories, suspicions, vehicle sightings, rumors, and possible connections, each one requiring some level of review. A caller might remember a dark SUV near Brooks Station Road. Another might report a man who seemed nervous after the murder. Someone else might point to a neighbor who had unexplained scratches. A driver could resemble the composite description but have a documented reason for being somewhere else. A vehicle might look right until investigators checked the model, registration, or owner. Public attention was essential. It expanded the number of eyes looking for the same person. But it also created noise. People misremember colors. They confuse dates. A black vehicle becomes dark blue in different light. A sighting from August 7th gets mixed up with something seen the following weekend. And once a suspect description is made public, ordinary encounters can begin to feel suspicious in hindsight. Detectives could not simply dismiss those reports. The one vague recollection that sounded like nothing might be the one that mattered. So the work became repetitive and painstaking. Record the tip, identify the person or vehicle, check the timeline, compare the description, and decide whether the lead could be closed. Then do it again. And again. The working description was distributed to law enforcement agencies across Massachusetts. Officers were told to watch for a Latino man of medium height and athletic build, someone who may have had visible scratches or bruises after August 7th. He was believed to have access to a dark SUV and to know the area around Princeton. That last part was important. Princeton was small, with only around 3,000 residents, but the investigation could not stop at the town line. People entered the community every day without living there. Delivery drivers, contractors, utility workers, commuters. Anyone whose job regularly placed him on those roads could know the landscape as well as a resident did. So investigators reviewed local men, workers, drivers, reported sightings, and vehicles. They looked for someone who matched not just one element, but several. The physical description, the right kind of vehicle, familiarity with the region, and the possibility of injuries caused during Vanessa's resistance. The DNA beneath her fingernails remained the strongest filter they had. But DNA evidence does not identify a stranger by magic. A laboratory profile can tell detectives whether a sample matches. It cannot hand them the correct person unless they first find someone to compare it against. That meant collecting comparison samples in a controlled, documented process. Each volunteer or person of interest had to be identified. Consent and collection had to be recorded. The sample had to be labeled, preserved, submitted, tested, and connected to the correct name. Then, investigators had to wait for the result. Most came back as exclusions. That is still useful. Every exclusion removes one possibility. But for Vanessa's family, an exclusion was not an arrest. It was another person who was not the man they were waiting for police to find. Weeks became months. The case stayed visible. Roadside signs reminded drivers that investigators still wanted information. Images from press conferences appeared in news coverage. Photographs from the original search remained attached to every update. In Princeton, the investigation became part of the daily landscape, a public appeal that everyone recognized, but no one could yet resolve. For Vanessa Marcotte and the rest of Vanessa's family, that visibility cut both ways. It kept Vanessa's name in front of the public. It encouraged witnesses to keep calling. It told the killer that the case had not been forgotten. But every new press conference without an arrest also confirmed the same painful fact. Detectives still had Vanessa's DNA evidence, a description, and hundreds of leads, but not the stranger's name. The comparison samples kept coming. 10, 50, 100. Eventually, investigators would collect 325. The number matters because it shows how the breakthrough really happened. It was not one brilliant guess. It was months of eliminating men who did not match, checking vehicles that led nowhere, and following recollections that collapsed under closer examination. The decisive sample would be number 325. But before detectives could collect it, someone first had to notice the right man in the right vehicle. By then, the theory of a shared offender in Queens had faded. What remained was narrower, but in some ways more difficult. Vanessa's killer was probably connected to the local area, perhaps only through the work that brought him there. He could know Princeton without calling it home. He could pass through its roads, finish his route, and disappear back into a neighboring city. 7 months after the murder, an officer noticed a black SUV. He wrote down one license plate number, and the investigation finally moved from a description to a door. The black SUV did not belong to a known violent offender. It belonged to a married delivery driver with 3 children, and no criminal history pointing toward Vanessa's murder. That was what made the lead so easy to underestimate. By March 2017, investigators had spent roughly 8 months following tips, checking vehicles, interviewing possible witnesses, and collecting DNA from men who might fit the description developed during the investigation. More than 1,300 tips had come in. Hundreds of possibilities had gone nowhere. The man they were looking for was still, in every meaningful sense, a stranger. Then a patrol officer in neighboring Worcester noticed a black SUV. The vehicle itself mattered because witnesses had reported seeing a dark SUV near the area where Vanessa was attacked. The man driving it also appeared consistent with the description circulated among law enforcement agencies. A Latino man of medium height with an athletic build. Neither detail proved anything. Dark SUVs were common. A general physical description could fit thousands of people. But the entire investigation had reached the point where ordinary observations had to be preserved and checked. So the officer did exactly that. He recorded the license plate and forwarded the information to the investigators working Vanessa's case. That plate gave them a name. The SUV was registered to Angelo Colon Ortiz, then 31 years old. Colon Ortiz was a native of Puerto Rico who lived in Worcester. He had moved to the city less than a year earlier. He was married, had 3 children, and did not have a criminal record that immediately connected him to an attack like this. To be clear, despite conflicting accounts that have named John W. Lindbergh, it was Angelo Colon Ortiz who was identified through the investigation, arrested, and ultimately convicted in Vanessa Marcotte's case. And once detectives looked beyond the vehicle registration, one part of Colon Ortiz's life immediately stood out. His job put him on the road. Colon Ortiz worked as a delivery driver, servicing post offices in Worcester, Princeton, and other nearby communities. That detail answered one of the questions investigators had been asking almost from the beginning. If Vanessa had been attacked by a stranger, why had that stranger been in Princeton? This was not a large city where an unfamiliar face could disappear into a crowd. Princeton had only around 3,000 residents. The area near Brooks Station Road was quiet, wooded, and familiar mainly to people who lived nearby or had some reason to travel through it. Investigators had considered that the killer might be local. But they had also left room for another possibility. Someone who did not live in Princeton, yet knew the area because work or routine brought him there. Colon Ortiz fit that second possibility. He lived in Worcester, but his delivery route gave him a legitimate reason to travel through Princeton and the surrounding towns. He could appear to be an outsider while still knowing the roads. He did not have to be a resident to understand how quiet the area could become, or how quickly someone could leave it. Again, none of that made him guilty. A vehicle, a broad physical resemblance, and a work route were enough to investigate, not enough to arrest. Detectives still needed something that could move Colon Ortiz from a name on a registration record to a person connected directly with the evidence Vanessa had left behind. So they went to his home. When investigators arrived, Colon Ortiz was there with his wife and their 3 children. There was no dramatic history waiting to be uncovered. No earlier violent case that neatly explained why officers were at his door. On the surface, they were speaking with a working father whose vehicle and appearance had caught an officer's attention. There was also a language issue to handle carefully. Colin Ortiz was not fluent in English, so an interpreter was involved when investigators asked him to provide a saliva sample for DNA testing. He agreed. By then, this procedure was anything but unusual for the investigative team. Colin Ortiz's sample was the 325th comparison sample collected in the case. Think about that number for a second. 324 samples had already been taken before his. Each represented a person investigators had considered closely enough to compare against the unidentified male DNA recovered from Vanessa, and each previous comparison had failed to give them the answer they needed. Now there was another swab, another name, another possibility that might disappear as soon as the laboratory finished its work. The sample was sent for analysis, and the waiting began. Laboratory comparison is not the dramatic instant television sometimes makes it look like. Investigators could not simply look at Colin Ortiz and know whether the officer's observation had led them to the right man. His genetic profile had to be developed and compared with the male profile recovered from Vanessa. Until that process was complete, he remained one of hundreds. Then the result came back. According to investigators, the DNA from Colin Ortiz matched the crime scene profile. After 8 months, more than 1,300 tips, and 324 earlier comparison samples, detectives believed they finally had the identity of the stranger Vanessa had encountered during the last walk of her life. The match changed the case immediately. It supplied probable cause for an arrest warrant because it connected Colin Ortiz to biological evidence recovered from Vanessa. This was no longer a lead built only on a dark SUV, a circulated description, or a delivery route through Princeton. It was a direct forensic connection. But DNA could answer only one part of the mystery. It could identify the man whose genetic material Vanessa carried away from the attack. It could not reconstruct every moment of what happened. It could not tell investigators how the encounter began, whether Vanessa was watched before she was approached, or why she was selected. And it could not explain the motive that had remained unknown from the start. Colin Ortiz was taken into custody. At first, he denied any involvement in Vanessa's murder. He said he did not know her and had never met her. He also claimed he could barely remember whether he had been in Princeton on August 7, 2016. That left detectives with a sharp contradiction. The suspect said he could not place himself in Princeton and had no connection to Vanessa. The DNA said their paths had crossed. After months of anonymous tips, eliminated names, and comparison samples that led nowhere, investigators believed sample number 325 had identified the man Vanessa fought during her final moments. But identifying him was only the beginning. They still had to show what he was doing there. DNA placed Colin Ortiz inside the case. A $5 purchase would help place him near the scene. At approximately 2:35 p.m. on August 7th, someone bought just $5 worth of gas near the crime scene. Investigators said the customer was Angelo Colin Ortiz. $5. It sounds almost meaningless. The kind of purchase most people would forget before reaching the next intersection. But this receipt landed inside the most important window of the entire case. Vanessa had left her mother's home at around 1:00 p.m. Vanessa Marcotte would report her missing at approximately 4:00. Somewhere between those two moments, Vanessa encountered the stranger who killed her. And at 2:35, according to the investigative records, Colin Ortiz was close by. The receipt did not prove that he attacked Vanessa. It did not place him on the trail or inside the wooded area where her body was found. A gas purchase cannot tell detectives what someone did before arriving at the pump, or where he went after leaving it. What it could do was challenge any suggestion that Colin Ortiz had been nowhere near Princeton that afternoon. His presence in the area also made sense for another reason. Colin Ortiz worked as a delivery driver, servicing post offices in Princeton, Worcester, and surrounding towns. He was not a stranger to the region. He had a reason to know its roads and its smaller communities, even though he lived in Worcester and had moved there less than a year earlier. But August 7th did not appear to be an ordinary workday. Investigators learned that Colin Ortiz normally worked a morning shift. On the day Vanessa was killed, however, he had not shown up for work. Instead, records indicated that he was driving through the area in his dark SUV. The $5 purchase became a timestamp inside that unexplained stretch of his afternoon. Now step back and look at the chain the prosecution was assembling. Witnesses had described a Latino man of medium height and athletic build near a dark SUV. A patrol officer later noticed Colin Ortiz in a black Jeep and believed that he resembled the description circulated during the investigation. Colin Ortiz's delivery work regularly brought him into Princeton. The gas receipt placed him near the crime scene during the critical window. And then there was sample number 325, the saliva sample that matched the male genetic material recovered from beneath Vanessa's fingernails. Any one of those facts, standing alone, could be challenged. A dark SUV was hardly rare. A general physical description could fit more than one person. Working in Princeton did not make someone a killer. Buying gas nearby did not place a man at the exact location of an attack. But the DNA changed how every other detail looked. That is the difference between a collection of coincidences and a prosecution theory with several points of support. The vehicle led investigators toward Colin Ortiz. His work explained his familiarity with Princeton. The receipt placed him nearby at the relevant time. The genetic match connected him directly to evidence Vanessa had preserved during her final struggle. Still, it is important to separate what records established from what prosecutors believed happened. The employment information, vehicle records, receipt, and laboratory comparison were pieces of evidence. They could be documented, examined, and disputed in court. The precise sequence of the attack was a reconstruction built from that evidence. The condition of the scene, Vanessa's injuries, and the fact that her phone had been taken. According to the state's account, Colin Ortiz encountered Vanessa while she was alone, assaulted her, took her phone, beat and strangled her, and then tried to burn or otherwise conceal her body. But the evidence described in the case did not answer every question about how that encounter began. It did not establish whether Colin Ortiz had gone out that afternoon intending to find a victim, whether he noticed Vanessa by chance, or what passed through his mind before he approached her. That uncertainty mattered because the through question had now split into two parts. Investigators believed they had identified the stranger. What they still did not have was an explanation. Before prosecutors could put that question before a jury, however, the defense attacked the evidence at the center of the case. Colin Ortiz was not fluent in English. When investigators visited his home, they spoke with him through an interpreter, and he agreed to provide a saliva sample. His attorneys later argued that the language barrier prevented him from giving meaningful consent. In their view, he had not fully understood what officers were asking him to do or the consequences of handing over his DNA. This was not a minor procedural complaint. If a judge found that the sample had been obtained unlawfully, the defense could ask to have it suppressed. In plain language, that meant the jury might never be allowed to hear the direct comparison between Colin Ortiz's saliva and the genetic material recovered from Vanessa. Think about what that would do to the case. The state might still have the SUV, the physical resemblance, his connection to Princeton, the missed work shift, and the $5 receipt. But without the admissible DNA match, those facts would carry a very different weight. The most direct link between Colin Ortiz and Vanessa's struggle could be kept outside the courtroom. The court rejected the defense challenge. It ruled that the saliva sample had been lawfully collected and could remain in the case. That decision preserved the prosecution's central forensic evidence. It also left the location timeline intact. Colin Ortiz knew the area through his work, matched the broad witness description, drove a vehicle resembling the one witnesses had noticed, and made a documented purchase near the scene during the hours Vanessa was missing. But a surviving prosecution case is not the same thing as a quick resolution. The proceedings moved slowly. Motions had to be argued. Evidence had to be reviewed. The defense tested how investigators had obtained the sample and how the state intended to use it. Years passed between Colin Ortiz's 2017 arrest and the case's eventual resolution in 2022. During that time, the investigation changed form. At first, this had been quiet forensic work. Laboratory reports, tips, vehicle descriptions, employment records, and a receipt for $5 worth of gas. Then came the courtroom photographs. Colin Ortiz seated beside his attorney. Prosecutors presenting their case. Vanessa's family waiting through another hearing. The search for an unknown stranger had become a public legal reckoning with one named defendant at its center. By then, the state had survived the defense's most consequential challenge. The DNA comparison would be allowed into evidence, and the prosecution's timeline had not collapsed. Colin Ortiz was facing a trial built around both forensic and location evidence. But when the case finally approached its courtroom conclusion, The most important unanswered question would not be put to a jury. Colin Ortiz changed his plea. For years, Vanessa's family prepared themselves to endure a trial. Then, Angelo Colin Ortiz admitted responsibility, without telling them why he had chosen Vanessa. That distinction mattered. A guilty plea could settle the legal question. It could spare Vanessa Marcotte and the rest of the family from sitting in a courtroom while prosecutors presented the crime scene photographs, forensic findings, medical testimony, and every other painful detail needed to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. But a plea could not explain the attack. Colin Ortiz had initially denied knowing Vanessa. He claimed he could barely remember being in Princeton on the day she was killed. Now, confronted with the DNA match and the evidence placing him near the scene, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and unarmed robbery. The agreement meant there would be no full trial. It also changed the final list of charges. The rape charge was dismissed as part of the negotiated resolution. That did not erase the medical or forensic findings from the investigation. It did not rewrite what investigators believed had happened to Vanessa. It meant only that Colin Ortiz would not be separately convicted and sentenced on that particular charge. This is one of those legal outcomes that can sound contradictory if you only hear the final counts. A charge can be removed in a plea agreement even though the evidence behind the allegation remains part of the case history. Plea negotiations are about what the defendant formally admits, what the prosecution agrees not to pursue, and what punishment the court can impose without requiring a trial. And for Vanessa's relatives, avoiding that trial carried a real emotional weight. Her uncle, Stephen Therian, said that an admission could not bring Vanessa back. Nothing could. But it could prevent the family from being pulled through an extended courtroom battle, forced to hear the most traumatic parts of her death described again and again. Think about what they had already lived with. 6 years had passed since Vanessa left her mother's home for that final walk. The investigation had brought uncertainty, thousands of leads, DNA testing, an arrest, legal challenges, and years of waiting for the case to reach a conclusion. Vanessa's father, John, died before that conclusion came. The family entered the final hearing, grieving not only for Vanessa, but also for a father who never got to see the man charged with killing his only daughter formally accept responsibility. On November 2nd, 2022, the case reached sentencing in Worcester Superior Court. Rosanna spoke about the last time she saw Vanessa alive. What stayed with her was her daughter's smile before she headed out. It was an ordinary image from what should have been an ordinary afternoon, and that was exactly why it carried so much force. Rosanna had no reason to think she was watching Vanessa leave for the last time. 6 years later, she had to describe that memory in the same courtroom as the man who admitted killing her. Other relatives delivered statements about the life that had been taken and the damage that continued long after August 7, 2016. Available photographs from the proceedings show Vanessa's family gathered together through an intensely emotional hearing. Their own words documented the grief more clearly than any imagined courtroom description could. There was relief that the case was ending, but no suggestion that the ending could make the family whole. Colin Ortiz's attorney, Eduardo Masferrer, expressed condolences to the Marcotte family and said his client regretted what he had done. The defense spoke of remorse and asked forgiveness from those harmed by his actions. Colin Ortiz himself, however, did not publicly supply the missing explanation. He admitted killing Vanessa. He did not explain why. That silence left the through question of the case only half answered. Investigators had found the stranger. They had connected him to Vanessa through the DNA she carried beneath her fingernails, his vehicle, his presence near Princeton, and the $5 gas purchase made close to the crime scene. The evidence had finally forced a legal acknowledgement of responsibility, but it could not force a motive out of him. The court sentenced Colin Ortiz to life imprisonment for second-degree murder, with an additional consecutive sentence for unarmed robbery. In Massachusetts, a second-degree murder conviction carries the possibility of parole, unlike a first-degree murder conviction resulting in life without parole. But eligible does not mean released. It only means that, after the minimum period has been served, the prisoner may ask a parole board to consider release. Because of the consecutive structure of these sentences, Colin Ortiz would not become eligible for parole for approximately 45 years. That places his first possible eligibility in 2067, when he would be about 81 years old. So while the sentence did not formally guarantee that he would die in prison, it created the very real possibility that he would spend the remainder of his life there. Rosanna acknowledged that she might never be able to forgive the man who took her daughter. At the same time, she expressed relief that the legal process was finally over and satisfaction that the sentence reflected the seriousness of what he had done. Outside the courtroom, she thanked the people who had carried the case to that point. Investigators who stayed with it through more than 1,000 tips, prosecutors who built the case, witnesses who came forward, volunteers who helped search, and members of the public who refused to let Vanessa's name disappear as the years passed. That gratitude did not soften the loss. It recognized how many people had been needed to bring one stranger to justice. The legal question was settled. Angelo Ortiz admitted killing Vanessa Marcotte and received a sentence that could keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life. But the plea closed the case before a trial could expose every detail. Justice arrived, but the one answer Vanessa's family could not obtain was the reason this stranger stopped for her. A conviction can end a prosecution. It cannot restore the future that disappeared on Brooks Station Road, and it cannot prevent two families from living with the consequences. For Vanessa's family, the sentence meant that the man responsible had finally been held accountable. It meant no more uncertainty about whether the case would remain unsolved, no more waiting for an unknown attacker to be identified. But accountability and restoration are not the same thing. Vanessa was still gone. Her mother, Rosanna, still had to return to a life shaped by the absence of her only daughter. Her relatives and friends still had to live with all the ordinary moments Vanessa should have been there to share. Career milestones, holidays, weddings. Conversations no one expected had already ended. The arrest also changed the lives of the people closest to Angelo Ortiz. He had been living with his wife and their 3 children when investigators arrived. Reports indicated that his wife sought a divorce soon after his arrest. Suddenly, she faced the task of separating her children from the details of a crime they were too young to fully understand, and eventually explaining why their father would remain in prison. That does not place the two families' losses on equal ground. It simply shows how violence keeps moving outward. One decision made on one Sunday afternoon reached into homes that had never met, leaving consequences that would last for decades. Vanessa's family had to decide what could possibly remain when the court process was over. Their answer began taking shape in 2017 when they established the Vanessa T. Marcotte Foundation. The organization was created not to define Vanessa by the way she died, but to continue something her family believed had always been part of her life: her desire to help other people. Through workshops, webinars, community events, and self-defense instruction, the foundation began offering education focused on violence prevention and personal safety. Women gathered for training sessions. Groups came together for public events. Participants joined the foundation's 5K run and walk, and slowly, Vanessa's name appeared in a different setting. During the investigation, people had seen it on news reports, roadside signs, and requests for tips. Her name had been connected to a search, a crime scene, and an unidentified DNA profile. Now it appeared on shirts worn by people running together. It appeared in photographs of group gatherings and training sessions. It belonged to an organization doing work in the present tense. There is an important line to draw here. Teaching personal safety does not mean Vanessa was responsible for what happened to her. She went for a walk in daylight, near her mother's home, in a place she had known for years. She did nothing wrong. The responsibility belonged entirely to the stranger who attacked her. No workshop can guarantee that violence will never happen. No safety rule can transfer responsibility from an offender to a victim. The Foundation's work is about giving people information, confidence, and practical tools. Not suggesting that Vanessa could have prevented another person's deliberate act. And when you return to the evidence, there is one fact that stands above everything else. Vanessa resisted. The man who attacked her tried to conceal what he had done. But beneath Vanessa's fingernails, investigators found genetic material that survived those efforts. In the final moments of a struggle she never chose, she preserved the evidence that would identify him. That evidence alone did not solve the case overnight. Detectives still had to find the person it belonged to. They processed more than 1,300 tips. They compared descriptions. They looked for a dark SUV and a man who knew the Princeton area. They collected hundreds of voluntary DNA samples, one after another, with no promise that the next one would be any different from the last. Then came sample number 325. The match gave investigators what months of interviews, tips, and searches had not: a name attached to the unknown profile. It connected Angelo Ortiz to Vanessa with scientific precision. Other evidence placed him near the area. His guilty plea ultimately resolved the legal question of responsibility. Who attacked Vanessa Marcotte? The justice system answered that, but the question running underneath the entire case was never fully resolved. Why her? Why there? Why did a stranger see Vanessa on an ordinary Sunday afternoon and decide to attack? Ortiz admitted guilt, but he did not provide a motive. Because the case ended in a plea rather than a full trial, that inner reason was never tested through days of testimony and argument. Investigators established what the evidence could prove. They could reconstruct movements, compare DNA, examine records, and place a vehicle near the scene. What they could not do was force an honest explanation from the person who knew the answer. That is the strange imbalance at the center of this case. The physical evidence is exact. The motive is empty space. Maybe that is why the photographs of Vanessa matter so much now. They return the focus to the life that existed before Brooks Station Road became a crime scene. Vanessa was a daughter who kept close ties with her family even after moving to New York. She was a friend remembered for her humor and energy. She was ambitious, hardworking, and building a career that had already taken her from Boston University to WordStream, Vistaprint, and then Google. She had plans that extended far beyond that summer weekend in Princeton. Her family wanted people to remember that whole person, not only the victim described in court documents. The foundation carries that intention forward. Every class, gathering, webinar, training session, and 5K held in Vanessa's name places something living beside the loss. It cannot replace her. It does not answer why she was targeted. But it ensures that public attention did not disappear when the headlines moved on. Vanessa's case is no longer unsolved. The evidence she preserved helped investigators hold her attacker accountable, and years of patient police work gave that evidence a name. Still, closure is a complicated word. A sentence can close a file. A guilty plea can prevent years of hearings. A conviction can tell a family that the person responsible will not walk free. But can any of that feel like closure when the one person who could explain why refuses to do so? Let me know what you think in the comments. Did the guilty plea provide meaningful closure? Or did the absence of a motive leave the most important question unanswered? And if you want to join us for more Dark Crime Storytime episodes, please subscribe.